The 17th of January, 1945, north of Wiltz, Luxembourg, the Ardennes still held the war inside its frozen trees. Snow lay over shell craters like burial cloth, pines cracked in the cold. Somewhere far off, artillery rolled across the hills with the slow, exhausted thunder of a continent tearing itself apart. In a ditch beside the remains of an American truck, a handful of German soldiers, hollow-cheeked and white with frost, worked at a stack of abandoned tins with numb fingers and a captured opener. Their gloves were stiff. Their breath came out in ragged clouds. They expected grease, perhaps, salt meat, beans, something heavy and colorless, the kind of food that belonged to war. But when the lid finally broke its seal, the sound was not dramatic, just a soft metallic sigh. And inside, in the gray light of that winter afternoon, there was fruit, yellow halves resting in bright syrup, a sweetness so intact, so unnecessary, so almost offensively gentle, that for a moment the men did not move at all. It is tempting to make too much of such a scene, to turn a can into a miracle and a mouthful of peaches into the end of an ideology. War is never so neat. Men did not drop their weapons because they found sugar in an enemy ration. Armies do not collapse from one glimpse into a tin. And yet history often hides its verdicts in moments smaller than maps. A state may announce its greatness with banners, speeches, and columns of steel, but the truth of that greatness is often measured elsewhere, in whether trains arrive, whether fuel reaches the front, whether boots fit, whether ammunition comes on time, whether food can travel thousands of miles and still carry within it variety, calories, comfort, and the quiet promise that tomorrow will also be supplied. In that sense, the open American can in a frozen ditch was not merely food, it was a document. For years, Nazi propaganda had taught the German soldier what America was supposed to be: materialistic, soft, undisciplined. A nation of shopkeepers, immigrants, jazz, assembly lines, and comfort. Hermann Goering mocked the United States as a place that could make refrigerators and razor blades, but not the weapons needed to defeat Germany. That contempt mattered because it told German soldiers what to expect from the enemy: wealth without hardness, machines without endurance, abundance without soul. They were taught that history would be decided by will, race, obedience, and sacrifice, not by canned fruit crossing an ocean in wartime and arriving unopened in a forest half a world away. The German soldier had been trained to believe in scarcity as proof of virtue. Hunger was sacrifice, endurance was nobility, discomfort was cleansing. The field kitchen, the iron ration, the black bread, the bitter substitute coffee, the thin stew swallowed in haste beside mud and engines, these things were not merely the conditions of war. They were woven into the myth of the Wehrmacht as a force hardened by necessity and purified by struggle. American plenty, by contrast, was meant to signify weakness. The enemy's comfort was supposed to rot him from within. A soldier who had oranges, cigarettes, and chocolate could not, in that vision, possess the inner steel of the man who marched on little and endured much. But this belief had always contained a dangerous illusion. Hardship can sometimes strengthen an army. It can also simply starve it. Deprivation can forge endurance. It can also hollow out judgment, morale, and faith. By the time German soldiers were opening captured American supplies in the West, many of them had already passed through years in which the heroic language of sacrifice had begun to taste less like destiny and more like failure. The diary of William Hoffman at Stalingrad records the descent with brutal clarity. On December 26, he wrote, "The horses have already been eaten. I would eat a cat. They say its meat is also tasty." The same entry observed that the soldiers looked like corpses or lunatics, looking for something to put in their mouths. By January 1943, the note had collapsed into the essence of defeat. The cold is unbearable. The soldiers are completely broken. No more ammunition, no more food, no more hope. Those sentences were written at Stalingrad, not in the Ardennes, but they reveal something essential about the mental world carried forward by German survivors and replacements alike. Long before the Reich physically collapsed, many of its promises had already begun to do so at the level of the body. Bodies do not read propaganda the way minds do. A body knows whether it is warm. It knows whether it is fed. It knows whether the promised superiority of one civilization can survive a Russian winter, an Allied bombing campaign, a broken rail line, or the simple arithmetic of not enough calories. The body is the first dissident in a failing system. And in the West, by 1944, the arithmetic had become merciless. German commanders in Normandy acknowledged that the Allies were employing men, materiel, and technical means on the greatest scale so far, that they possessed complete mastery in the air, and that in just 2.5 days, 29,000 Allied sorties had been counted, with aircraft dive bombing and strafing every movement on the ground, even a single soldier. The report admitted that attacks on transport had made German supply and replacement a very serious problem. Those are not the words of enemy propaganda. They are the language of a command, forced to describe what it could not match. Against that reality stood the American ration system, unglamorous in design, but revolutionary in implication. The U.S. Army formally adopted the C ration on the 1st of November, 1939. It contained 3 cans with meat and vegetable components, and 3 more with crackers, sugar, and soluble coffee, providing 2,974 calories and 114 grams of protein. As the war developed, the broader C ration program expanded into multiple meat varieties and accompanying items that included biscuits, candies, jam, citrus drink powder, cocoa, cigarettes, matches, toilet paper, chewing gum, and the humble opener that turned sealed metal into immediate sustenance. This was not luxury in the civilian sense. It was industrialized. Reliability. The promise was not that every meal would be delicious. The promise was that the front would be connected to the factory, the cannery, the warehouse, the ship, the truck, and the clerk who counted it all. And then there were the peaches. Not always in the standard individual ration, not always at hand, not the center of Army nutrition in any technical sense, yet they lingered in memory with unusual force. The Library of Congress, Veterans History Project, preserves a line that explains why. There is something remarkable about eating canned peaches when you are in the field. Another veteran remembered the syrup as champagne. The importance of the peach was not biochemical. It was civilizational. It tasted less like mere sugar than like interruption, an interruption of mud, monotony, salt, fear, and iron discipline. It carried the memory of orchards, kitchens, summer tables, and the ordinary softness of civilian life. It was a reminder that the immense machinery of war was somehow still making room for sweetness. So imagine again the men in the Ardennes. Not because one can prove every detail of that exact ditch, but because countless moments like it became possible wherever the front shifted, and one army's supplies became another army's discovery. A German hand, cracked by cold and grime, lifts the lid. A small fragrance rises fruit, sugar, metal. Around it lie the true objects of late war Europe. Splintered wood, wet wool, spent cartridges, half-frozen corpses under blankets of snow, machine parts frozen to the touch. And at the center of that brutal inventory sits a can whose contents seem to belong to another universe. Not because peaches were grand, but because they were superfluous. They implied margin. A state struggling to survive does not send superfluous sweetness into a winter battlefield unless it can do so almost without feeling the loss. That was the deeper shock. German soldiers did not merely confront American food. They confronted American surplus. One peach half in syrup suggested not only a well-fed enemy, but an entire economy capable of producing beyond the minimum. An army can be made to fight on necessity. An army that can still move variety through global supply lines while fighting in multiple theaters announces something else entirely. That the enemy is not exhausting himself merely by existing. That he has depth. That behind the front there are farms, canneries, rail hubs, ports, refineries, machine shops, clerks, bookkeepers, longshoremen, steelworkers, and mothers sealing jars at home, all connected to the riflemen by systems too large to be seen from the ditch. In war, a can is never just a can. It is a condensed empire of process. The scale behind it was staggering. Even in 1938, before full American mobilization, U.S. national income was nearly double that of Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. The United States produced more steel than Germany and mined almost twice as much coal. By 1945, American factories had turned out more than 96,000 bombers, 86,000 tanks, 2.4 million trucks, and 6.5 million rifles, in addition to the billions of dollars worth of other supplies without which armies cannot move or eat. These figures matter here because the can in the snow was one of their smallest visible consequences. When German soldiers stared into American tins, they were looking into a miniature of the same industrial civilization that also filled the skies over Normandy and the roads behind Patton with trucks. This is where the emotional contrast becomes almost cruel. What many German soldiers expected from America was softness. What they encountered was hardness built on comfort. They expected decadence. What they found was discipline, supported by abundance. They expected a nation too spoiled to bear sacrifice. What they met was a democracy that had learned to mass-produce sacrifice, standardize it, crate it, ship it, and, when necessary, sweeten it. The American soldier did not defeat the Wehrmacht because he had peaches, but the fact that he might have peaches at all, along with coffee, cigarettes, sugar, fuel, boots, and replacements, while the German line struggled beneath constant attack, said something terrible about the balance of worlds. For the Germans, the most bitter element of the discovery may have been that the can seemed to make nonsense of years of ideological instruction. National Socialism had glorified struggle, as if struggle itself were proof of superiority. Yet here was the enemy's answer, packed in tin. Superiority was not proved by suffering more. It was proved by organizing more. The Reich could command men to endure. It could exhort, threaten, and mythologize. But could it feed consistently, replace losses, protect its movements by air, and connect home front to front line with a reliability visible, even in desert? Increasingly, the answer was no. The sound of the lid breaking its seal becomes important here as a symbol. Not the explosion of artillery, not the rattle of an MG-42, not the shriek of Stukas, not the deep mechanical throat of a Tiger tank, but the tiny click and peel of metal yielding to design. It is the sound of engineering serving appetite, the sound of planning surviving distance, the sound of an object made by anonymous hands for a soldier they would never meet, with the quiet assumption that he should have not merely calories, but order. In a dictatorship, power often announces itself through spectacle. In a functioning supply system, power often sounds like something much smaller. That is why the German report from Normandy reads almost like a confession written at staff level. It describes Allied naval support, endless aircraft, interrupted supplies, and movements made nearly impossible by bombing and strafing. One phrase is especially revealing. The proximity of the English mother country, and thus also of all the embarkation and supply bases, allowed the Allies the opportunity of employment on the greatest scale so far of men, material, and technical means. What the report is really admitting is that this was no ordinary enemy. It was an enemy whose political order, industrial base, and geographic position had fused into a system of relentless practical superiority. German soldiers on the ground did not need to read the report to understand its meaning. They felt it in the sky. They saw it in the traffic. They heard it in the drone of bombers and the arriving rumble of American columns. And sometimes, when fortune or disaster placed abandoned supplies in their hands, they tasted it. The contrast between expectation and experience became intimate there. Propaganda lives in abstractions. Food lives on the tongue. You can argue with a speech. You cannot argue with syrup. The American ration itself was built around that strange, modern idea that care could be standardized. The quartermaster system sought a stable, balanced combat ration to provide 3 meals a day when field kitchens could not operate. Over time, the varieties widened. Meat and beans, meat and vegetable stew, meat and spaghetti, ham and lima beans, pork and beans, and more, paired with biscuits, cereals, candy-coated peanuts or raisins, coffee, sugar, cocoa, jams, and cigarettes. None of this meant that American soldiers loved every ration. Many complained. Many got sick of them. But complaint is itself revealing. Men complain about monotony, when monotony is what remains after necessity has already been covered. For much of the late war Wehrmacht, necessity itself was increasingly uncertain. This, too, helps explain why the peach becomes such a potent recurring object. In another setting, it would be nothing. In civilian abundance, it would barely be noticed. But in wartime, Europe, and especially in the imagination of men trained to endure deprivation as virtue, the peach in syrup bordered on the surreal. It was yellow sunlight, sealed against winter. It was softness preserved against time. It was the orchard refusing to disappear, even when the world had become steel and ash. It represented an enemy whose system could somehow carry fragments of peace inside war. One can imagine what passed behind a German soldier's eyes in that moment. Not surrender, not revelation in some pure moral sense. More likely a colder thought, and more dangerous. If this is what their ordinary supply looks like, what else lies behind them? If this army can lose a truck and still scatter comfort into the snow, how many more trucks exist? If their men open cans like this as habit, what stands at the end of their roads, in their depots, on their docks, in their factories? If one side of the war is eating fruit preserved in sugar, while the other has learned to gnaw at whatever the weak allows, then perhaps the future has already chosen. And yet the scene was not merely about America. It was also about Germany's own internal lie. The Third Reich presented itself as the highest form of political organization, a regime in which weakness, inefficiency, and parliamentary compromise had been overcome by will. But the war exposed something fundamental. Democracies could be disorderly, argumentative, and slow to awaken. They could also, once awakened, organize free citizens, private industry, public institutions, and logistical complexity at a scale dictatorship had sneered at and then failed to equal. The can in the snow became, in that sense, an indictment, not only of German shortages, but of the very claim that authoritarian command necessarily produced superior modern power. Later, for many captured Germans, the lesson deepened in ways even more intimate. In camps in the United States, the first shock was often not brutality, but its absence. William Oberdiek, as recalled in a scholarly study of European POWs in the American High Plains, was disturbed to see tables set with real dinnerware and wondered, are they going to shoot us? Is it our last meal? The fear is almost heartbreaking in its logic. Good plates, proper tables, decent food, these seemed to him not normal, but suspicious, because the conditions of his world had taught him that dignity appeared only at the edge of death or ceremony, not as routine. Another former prisoner, Dietrich Kohl, remembered trying to keep small personal items like soap after capture, only to be told by military police to throw them away because America has everything better. His retrospective judgment was blunt. Soon we found out. They were right. There is a brutal simplicity in that line. It is not philosophical. It is empirical. It does not arise from abstract admiration of American ideals. It comes from repeated contact with material fact. Better soap, better towels, better food, better regularity, better access to the mundane things from which daily human dignity is assembled. Totalitarian systems often claim to offer greatness. But greatness that cannot produce ordinary sufficiency eventually reveals its theatrical core. Kurt Kohler wrote home from captivity that he could shower twice a day and get the finest soaps, socks, towels, even chocolate. The line matters because chocolate occupies the same symbolic territory as the peach. No army needs chocolate to fire a rifle. Chocolate signifies surplus carried all the way to the level of the individual. It means the system is not merely preserving life, it is provisioning morale. It is making the soldier feel connected to something larger than mere survival. In the American case, that something larger was not a racial destiny. It was an industrial democracy that, however imperfectly, assumed the citizen in uniform was worth supplying as a person, not just consuming as material. The contrast could become even sharper after the war. One former POW, Herman Eckert, later wrote that in the United States he had weighed about 175 pounds, but after 2 years back home, he was down to 130 and near starvation. That single number pair tells its own story. It reveals how the war's ideological maps and the war's nutritional maps diverged. Germany had promised a new order. America, even as captor, provided calories sufficient to change a man's body in ways that post-war Germany could not sustain. When ideology collides with metabolism, metabolism wins. None of this means that every German soldier who tasted American food became a Democrat in his heart. History is not sentimental. Some remained loyal to Nazism. Some merely envied what they saw. Some interpreted abundance not as a sign of a better political order, but only as proof of a richer enemy. Others were too tired, too traumatized, too implicated, or too frightened to think beyond the next meal. Transformation in war is rarely theatrical. It happens by erosion. A certainty weakens. A slogan sounds thinner. A contempt once passionately held becomes harder to utter without irony. One lie is not shattered by argument, but by repetition of contrary experience. And that repetition was relentless. American abundance was not confined to one glamorous moment. It came in convoys, crates, fuel dumps, ammunition stacks, cigarettes and accessory packets, coffee powder and ration tins, replacement boots, medical supplies, engines, spare parts, and the maddening persistence of an enemy whose logistical bloodstream kept flowing, even under strain. To the German soldier who had been raised on the romance of heroic hardness, this could be psychologically disorienting. The Americans were not weak despite their abundance. They were stronger because of what abundance allowed them to preserve: energy, movement, mood, recovery, and the sense that the state behind them possessed more to give. This is where the can becomes democratic in a deeper sense, not because tin itself votes, but because the object carries within it an entire civic arrangement. It implies agricultural surpluses raised by farmers not under direct military command, factories able to shift from civilian production to war output, rail and shipping networks managed across immense distances, standardized contracting, food science, inspection, labels, nutrition studies, warehouse accounting, and a culture in which millions of people who would never touch a rifle nonetheless became participants in supplying one. A dictatorship can seize. A democracy, when mobilized, can coordinate. The difference is easy to miss until one side's soldier opens the other side's can in the snow. The peach, then, is more than sweetness. It is permission. Permission for memory to survive amid destruction. Permission for the future to remain imaginable. A soldier eating peaches in the field is reminded that civilization still exists somewhere beyond the tree line, that kitchens, orchards, stores, porches, and normal summers have not vanished from the earth. German soldiers, by contrast, increasingly inhabited a war in which the future had narrowed into endurance itself. The regime offered apocalypse disguised as destiny. The American can offer something far smaller, and therefore, in its own way, far more convincing: continuity. There is something remarkable about eating canned peaches when you are in the field, the Library of Congress recollection says. Remarkable not because the peach is rare, but because war makes tenderness rare. Remarkable because sugar can suddenly feel like evidence. Remarkable because the human mind, deprived long enough, begins to recognize ordinary comfort as a form of truth. And when a system can deliver that truth at scale, it possesses a legitimacy no speech alone can manufacture. By the winter of 1944 and into 1945, German soldiers in the West were not only fighting Allied divisions, they were fighting the accumulated consequences of earlier strategic fantasies. The fantasy that ideological fervor could substitute for fuel, that brutality could replace planning, that conquest itself would solve shortages, that terror imposed on occupied Europe would generate a stable imperial economy, that the United States would remain commercially clever but militarily unserious. The Open American can contradicted all of these in miniature. It said, "The enemy has not merely armed himself, he has provisioned himself. He has not merely mobilized, he has learned how to sustain the mobilization." There's also, buried in this, a moral contrast worth noticing. The Nazi system fed itself through plunder, coercion, racial hierarchy, and the deliberate starving of others. It conceived human beings in ranked categories of worth. American democracy was far from innocent, far from equal, and still marked by racism and exclusion on the home front. But in the European War, it demonstrated something the Reich never could: that a free industrial society, for all its contradictions, could convert its productive life into military force without making deprivation its central creed. It could oppose tyranny, not only with guns, but with the infrastructure of ordinary life. Not with a mythology of chosen hardness, but with the practical strength of millions participating in a shared system. He held it in his hand. He saw its shine under weak winter light. He smelled the contents. He understood, perhaps only for a few seconds, that the enemy's strength was not only in what destroyed, but in what sustained. In those seconds, America's democracy did not appear as a constitution or a slogan. It appeared as a supply chain that had crossed oceans and battlefields to deliver even here, amid snow and ruin, something yellow, sweet, and unnecessary. And that unnecessary quality is precisely why it mattered. Total war compresses life into function. It teaches men to think in terms of fuel, ammunition, distance, losses, and usable calories. The peach violated that brutal reduction. It reminded whoever looked at it that human beings are not built only to persist. They are built to remember pleasure, to recognize color, to feel sudden gratitude, to compare misery with the memory of another world. A system that can protect even a little of that, even in wartime, wields a power that goes beyond military efficiency. It offers not only survival, but a reason survival should mean anything. The symbolism returns to the sound, the metallic pop of the lid, small, almost comic beside artillery. Yet history sometimes turns not on the loudest sound, but on the quietest contradiction. A dictatorship had promised hardness and delivered collapse. A democracy had been mocked for comfort and delivered force wrapped in comfort's memory. In the forest, in the camp, in the letter's home, that contradiction kept repeating until it could no longer be ignored. So the scene lingers: snow, ditch, truck wreck, trembling fingers, the smell of cold iron, and inside the opened can a brightness no winter should have allowed, not victory. That is why the emotional force of the can lies not in envy, but in exposure. It exposed the shrinking horizon of the German war. It exposed the lie that abundance was softness. It exposed the hollowness of contempt for an enemy whose material life had already outgrown the categories assigned to him. And for those Germans who later crossed the Atlantic in captivity and saw camp stores, dinner tables, showers, chocolate, and weight returning to their bodies, the exposure became harder to dismiss. Some of them, in letters and recollections, spoke less like vanquished ideologues than like witnesses to an unexpected social reality. America, they discovered, did not simply possess more things. It possessed a different relationship to the ordinary. The ordinary is often underestimated by historians because battlefields draw the eye toward the spectacular. Tanks, offensives, breakthroughs, bombings, surrenders, these are visible drama. But the fate of ideologies may rest just as heavily on whether the ordinary can be maintained under pressure. Can a society preserve supply, variety, sanitation, and morale while waging global war? Can it keep feeding not only its soldiers, but the systems behind them? Can it make a rifle and also a can opener, a bomber and also a peach and syrup? The Third Reich dazzled with menace. The United States overwhelmed with continuity. Somewhere in that frozen ditch, then, the can did what no speech could do. It reduced the war to a human scale. A German soldier in itself, not redemption, just evidence. Evidence that freedom, whatever its failures, could organize abundance more powerfully than fear, could organize deprivation. Evidence that a society of free workers, flawed and quarrelsome and immense, had learned how to feed its armies while the Reich fed on myth. Evidence that the larger truth of the war was not only who fired better or marched farther, but whose way of life could sustain a future. In the end, perhaps that is why the image feels poetic without ceasing to be historical. The peach and syrup was not simply food, it was summer preserved against the season of dictators. It was civilian life carried intact through mechanized slaughter. It was democracy sealed in tin, opened at the edge of defeat, and shining there absurd, fragile, undeniable against the snow.